Hello, everybody, and welcome to Bravura in Conversation. I'm delighted to have here today with us Darren Philp, who's the Director of Policy and Market Engagement at Smart Pension and has a wealth of experience in pensions and also in the government side of pensions, which is rather interesting. And I'm here with my colleague, Emma Napier. Hi, Emma.
Hi, everyone.
And so, Darren, thanks very much for joining us today.
Thanks very much for having me.
It's an interesting time, and I know we've spoken a bit over the last week or two about our general thoughts on pensions and savings in the UK. But what's your current take on where we are and where we've come over the last few years?
That's a very big question to start off with, Jonathan. And I think anyone who's working in the pensions industry has probably been amazed at the sheer volume of stuff and change that is actually happening. And from my perspective, it's great that the government has got a proactive reform agenda. Our pension system has been developing over time. The introduction of auto enrolment and the introduction of freedom and choice. And actually, we're now getting into subject areas which is really about improving the value of those pensions, improving governance, and making sure that savers have, a decent chance of getting, a good retirement income. And that's got to be incredibly positive. Although sometimes I'm trying to work out how all of these different initiatives fit together, and test all of us. I think we can't avoid what's happened over the past sort of 18 months or so in terms of the global pandemic. And I think the pension sector, and in particular auto enrolment, has been pretty resilient during that time. I think, like a lot of other people, there was probably some concern about, persistency, participation, people opting out, especially in the early days of the pandemic. And I think one of the saviours there was the government introducing the furlough scheme that actually covered auto enrolment contributions as well. And I think that very much steadied the ship as far as, pensions was concerned. And I think that the pandemic has also forced the pensions industry to modernise a bit as well. To be able to be a bit more flexible in terms of working patterns, to remote workly, doing things like this, over Zoom or Teams. Other software platforms are available, of course. But instead of just doing it sort of face to face and physically. And I think I did a blog a little while ago in Professional Pensions, which was I won't say exactly what I said because you'd probably have to edit it out, but it did give the industry a bit of a kick up the backside when it came to technology and looking at different ways of doing things. And I think if you can take any sort of positives from what's happened over the past 18 months, I think it is that auto enrolment has held up well. But also, I think there's a lot more attention in the pensions industry now about resilience and using technology to deliver and support that resilience. So it's been a really interesting time. We've got a very sort of proactive government at the moment. And, there's always a balancing act to be had when it comes to pension policy between, initiatives to really improve outcomes for people, which we would all support and all think are a good idea, versus the pace of change. And I think at the moment, there is a slight risk that there is almost a bit too much going on, whether it be on the investment side, whether it be dashboards, small pots, statement season, increased reporting requirements. We had a value for money consultation out from the regulators last week. And all of these things are good. They are good initiatives that, will help improve stuff going forward. I think sometimes it's worth just taking a bit of a step back and thinking, how does this strategically all fit together? And, what is the type of pension system that we're actually looking for over the medium to longer term? And I think that, one of the problems, and I think you said I might get to wave a magic wand a bit later, and I'm looking forward to that. But I think, one of the problems that we have in pensions is that, it's very out of kilter with the political cycle. So you have politicians, quite correctly, coming in, wanting to affect change and wanting that change to sort of come through quite quickly because, you don't want to be known as the pensions minister that did something 20 years ago. There's no sort of political capital in that. But we need to remember that pensions are a very long-term game. The decisions and the frameworks that we're putting into place now potentially can impact on, savings over the next 30, 40, 50 years or so. And I think that, one of the great things about the introduction of auto-enrolment was the consensus that was developed through the Turner Commission. Which set out the problems in our pension system very, very clearly, but also described in great depth the trade-offs that the society faced. And, out of that, we had state pension reform, we had increases in state pension, we had auto-enrolment, the creation of the National Employment Savings Trust, but it was done in terms of that consensus. And that consensus in terms of auto-enrolment has held pretty well, actually, although sometimes it gets chipped away a bit every now and again, so I don't think the consensus was ever around, freedom and choice, for example, which was just sort of plucked out of the Chancellor's red box and sent the annuity price, sent the share prices of various annuity companies plummeting, mid-afternoon. And it does feel to me that sometimes we need to sort of take a step back and just, re-agree or redebate the strategy and the strategic framework within which we're basing policy interventions to improve outcomes for people.
I completely agree with that. I think there is a lot of change and a lot of individual small change or medium change. So, the likes of dashboard and the issues with small pots and statement season, and some of these things do feel a little perhaps late, and we perhaps should have come around to them a long time ago. And they don't seem to link together. They don't, as you say, there is no great, doesn't seem to be a great plan that looks at, in 2025, this is where we want the pension system to be, and in 2030, we want this is where we want the pension system to be.
I was going to add as well, sorry, Jonathan, you're just about to say something else, but just someone with a very small pensions brain, but immediately when you were talking there, I wrote down two things, and we were talking about the government and how we, we set out plans and policy and all that sort of stuff, and two things I'd written down. First thing was simplicity versus detail. And in my head, it always feels like, we live in this world. We live in a world of financial services, whether it's pensions, whether it's investments, whatever it is. And we talk about jargon and we talk about the complexities of things. Pensions is probably right up there in the top of the list. But how do we manage the trade-off that, whether it's government, whether it's education through schools or whatever it is, that being too simplistic and somebody not taking any notice of it, and then too much detail where someone says, actually, I can't understand it, so I'm not going to take any notice of it either. I mean, $1 million question, I guess.
It is, and I think it's something that, regulators, industry, has been grappling with over time. The thing about the pension system in the UK is we have never started from a blank sheet of paper. It's grown up organically over time. And what typically you've had is layers of rules and regulations that keep compounding on top of each other. And, you'll have interventions for totally proper and totally right things, like, securing, better DB funding, for example, defined benefit funding. You can't argue against that. But then, when that washes through the system, that does have an implication in terms of how many of these schemes are open, the affordability of these schemes, the burdens on employers and stuff. And quite often it takes a number of years, if not decades, for some of the consequences to sort of come through. And I think that, it's well documented some of the key sort of challenges and barriers to pensions. Yeah. So we know that, it is complicated. It shouldn't be complicated. Like, a defined contribution pension is basically a savings product. Yeah. Whereby, especially in an auto-enrolment environment, you don't even have to sort of decide to go in it now. That's done for you. You're defaulted into the scheme, you're defaulted into the default fund. And if you can continue making your contributions, and I'm sure we'll talk about adequacy shortly and stuff, but in a way you're saving, and that's a good thing. question there around, too much defaulting means that, or could mean that people just think job done. I don't have to sort of think about it. And we know that 8% isn't going to be enough for everyone. It'll be enough for some people, but it won't be enough for everyone. And almost, having too much automaticity within the system does then have the consequence of the engagement challenge. And I think that, technology and can really help in some of this as well, because we don't expect, or we don't need people to be experts on pensions. I'm quite happy to admit that, I don't, self-select my investments in my pension. I get auto-enrolled into a pension scheme, and I've always been in the default fund. I think, that's where the focus has been. Who am I to sort of try and second guess or improve on what the professionals are doing, but quite often you get the analogy of the car as well. Yeah, that we need to teach people how to drive. We need to teach people the rules of the road. We need to teach people how to fill the car up. Yeah, although that might be a bit of a challenge.
Bad analogy this week.
No, exactly. Yeah. But you don't have to understand the intricate workings of a car. And I think that there's a real challenge, to your point, around, the compliance world of having to disclose absolutely everything. And, from a risk point of view, just saying, well, we're going to have to tell you all this, because if we don't tell you all this, then the regulator's going to be cross if something goes wrong. Yeah. Versus something that is really clear, really simple, might not have like the pages and pages and pages of disclosure, but broadly speaking, is the right thing for people. So I think, that is a key challenge. And I think that, one of the things that we have seen within auto-enrollment, and especially the rise of the master trust, actually, which is basically, multi-employer schemes in the trust-based environment, I think you have seen more clearer communications coming through there, because trustees have got more discretion than FCA regulated providers to bespoke their comms and to, really judge what's in the best interests of their members. So there's always going to be that balancing act between, compliant comms and engaging comms. And I think that, we need to not take risks, because this is about people's money, but we need to sort of always challenge ourselves to put ourselves in the shoes of the person receiving the communication, because ultimately, most people don't work in the pensions industry. Most people don't really want to spend a lot of time thinking about their pensions. They'd rather spend time thinking about the latest smartphone or gadget or whatever, and they'll probably spend more time thinking about that and researching that than they would, their pension. So we just need to make it easy for people and use nudge to help people make sure they're doing the right thing.
I think that's absolutely right. And I was, funnily enough, Emma, I was going to say something very similar to what you were saying about people understanding, the end, what we're all in this industry about the end pension holder or the account holder, and for them to have the best retirement they can have. And that's what we all want to achieve. And as you quite rightly say, Darren, we've sort of got this trade-off all the time between compliance and simplicity, and we've got to find a better way, I think. And some providers, and certainly the master trusts are really leading the way on this. And I think since auto-enrollment came in, one of the big things has been that the master trusts are shaking that communications piece up, because there is a different governance structure. Yeah. So you're starting to see that come through. So that kind of leads me on a little bit to some of the change that is sort of imminent, in inverted commas. And something that particularly in the industry is getting a bit of press at the moment, good and bad, is the pensions dashboards program, and that's going to affect all savers in pensions products. And I don't think we've really seen anything quite like the extent of this before. There's benefits and challenges here. What's your take on the program and the potential benefits and problems?
Yeah, so I think that, we've been talking about the pensions dashboard for years, and research sort of quite often demonstrates that there's a disconnect between people and their pension. Like people quite, know that they've got a bank account, they've chosen the bank account, they're probably looking at their bank account, if not most days, most weeks. Yeah. Same with other sort of short-term savings products and products that they've set up. But I always think there's a bit of a distance between people and their pension. Yeah, it's like they don't often feel ownership of it, and that leads to a couple of challenges. One is, just building on from the discussion we were just having, there's a big engagement challenge there. How do you have that conversation with people, about something they don't really want to have a conversation about? So that's the first challenge. But there's also a second challenge around, how do you keep people in touch with their pensions? And we know that there are, goodness knows how many, sort of lost pots out there. And they're not necessarily small pots either. There can be some quite big entitlements that people might not know that they've had. Also, I think that the pensions industry, it's getting better, but has been a bit slow to sort of pick up on, some of the more forward-looking industries in terms of use of technology, dashboards, member portals, and all of that type of stuff. And I think, what the pensions dashboard program will do is it removes some of the barriers to engagement. It helps people track and trace their pension, which has got to be a good thing. It means that, they can find all of their pensions in one place. I often sort of think about myself in my 30s. I didn't know what pensions I had, and actually it was a pain in the backside to try and get any information. I'd probably have to call up a provider, be on hold for goodness knows how long, have to reset a password. Couldn't find my account number and all of that type of stuff. And, you've only got sort of a very short period in which to engage people. So it's almost like a miracle if someone like me thinks, okay, I'm going to have a look at my pension. Yeah. But if I then have to wait weeks and weeks and weeks for a letter to come through the post to say, this is your new password, or, this is your latest account and all of that type of stuff, the moment's gone. You've lost it. And actually, we're used to having everything at the end of our fingertips now. On the end of phones and all of that type of stuff. So I think, what the pensions dashboard does is it reconnects people with their pensions. You've got the track and trace functionality, but also, I'm not saying if, I'm saying when it's sort of up and running and built and all the providers and that are patched into the dashboard, then, you can log on, you've got secure ID verification, it will find your pensions, and in there is damn it real time. Yeah, there's going to be some challenges for defined benefit and all that type of stuff, but you're going to get a pretty good reflection, of the pension savings you've got. So it's got to be a great thing. I think politically it's been talked about for quite a while. And people can quite often be quick to say, oh, we should have a dashboard by now. Yeah, and I've got some sympathy with that view, but I don't think that the politicians and the industry really got a grip of it in the early years. It was almost like, yes, there was sentences in the budget and stuff saying, and the industry will develop a pensions dashboard. Well, okay, I don't think ministers necessarily had a magic wand that could just deliver that. And I think what we've seen over the past 18 months, 2 years or so, with the Money and Pension Service picking up the baton on some of this, is almost like the first sort of real drive into doing this properly. Yeah. And, they spent some time putting some proper discipline around the program. This is a big IT project. It's a big procurement exercise. There's lots of challenge. You can't wing this stuff. And while sometimes there is a bit of frustration in terms about the pace of that program, they're doing it properly. They're thinking through the issues. And that's got to be a good thing, because I think we've got one chance to get this right. Yeah. If there's a data breach with the dashboard, or if the ID stuff gets messed up, or if there's a scandal around it in the early days, that's it. So we need to sort of proceed carefully, but also, at a pace where we can make sure we've got the bases covered. Having said that, like, give me a dashboard as soon as possible, because, we've been talking about it for years and I just want to see one of these things actually in action. I think, what are some of the challenges? I think there's different challenges for different types of schemes. So, you know, there's obvious challenges for DB schemes. I'm not sure how many of them are still run out of cardboard boxes, probably not as many as there were a few years ago, but there is a digitization challenge there. Yeah, and sharing that information. And because you're not running real live account balances, you know, you might do a revaluation when it's requested. And you know, there's no requirement at the moment, or I think there might be one coming in about having to provide deferred benefit statements. So they might go years without actually revaluing someone's pension. DC is very different. We've obviously got a legacy of lots of small occupational schemes, which the government is trying, I was going to say squeeze out the market, but, you know, they're trying to improve standards and, you know, beat the consolidation drum. And, you know, you've got providers which are providing sort of, you know, normal money purchase DC schemes that should be able to connect into this stuff and to be able to, you know, patch into the dashboard quite relatively straightforward. Not absolutely straightforward, but relative compared to defined benefit and stuff. I think, you know, we've seen a lot of consolidation in the provider space. And I think one of the key challenges for the industry is sort of legacy systems, you know, so it's not quite sticking tape that, you know, sticks computers together and all of that type of stuff. But, you know, while lots of providers have modern systems and all of that type of stuff, there is the legacy there, and I think that's going to be a key challenge. I think there are a number of challenges with data. So, you know, if a scheme is sort of not necessarily closed, but an older scheme, you know, some of the data points might be out of date. And that obviously has challenges around ID verification and security and all of that. And even for more modern schemes and, you know, schemes that predominantly have sort of come into being in the auto enrollment space, the information that we have is only as good as the information the employer gives us. You know, so one of the strengths of auto enrollment is you don't have that member engagement that we had before. People are defaulted, but ultimately we're then very reliant on the employer giving us, you know, correct names, correct spelling. Like, you'll believe how many people call me Philip rather than Darren Philp, you know, and it's quite easy to sort of have that type of error within a system. So I think there's, you know, numerous challenges around data, but the industry needs to sort of improve data quality anyway. And I think that's got to be a joint effort between, you know, incentivizing or compelling employers to provide better data. But also, you know, as schemes, we all have regulatory responsibilities to make sure our data is good, you know, and not just that we've got data in a particular field, but also that we're actually thinking about the quality of that data as well. So I think the pensions dashboard and the sort of data improvement side of things sort of go hand in hand. So, but that's going to be a challenge, you know, and there's a different set of challenges depending on the different types of schemes and stuff. I think one of the big challenges is going to be the ID side of things, and not just the ID, but how do you match people? You know, how do you know that Darren Philp in Tunbridge is the same as Darren Philp with an old address, maybe in Leicester or somewhere like that? And I think that's going to be, you know, that's going to be a sticking point with the dashboard, I think. Obviously, this is people's personal data. So, you know, GDPR and the Information Commissioner's Office and all of that type of stuff comes into play. And, you know, quite rightly, we need to make sure that people's data is protected. You know, that's got to be a touchstone of this stuff. But the programme seems to be leaving all of the matching criteria and all of the liability onto providers and schemes in terms of doing this. So we're going to be forced to provide data onto the dashboard. I'm supportive of that. But we're not going to be told how to match. And actually, if we match it wrong, then it's going to be our fault. And you can see a degree of logic to that. Yeah, but you can argue it both ways as well, especially in a compulsory environment. But what is then the incentive on the providers and the schemes who are providing data into the dashboard? Yeah, it's to minimize risk. And quite rightly. But if you minimize risk, you maximize false negatives. So one of the key things that we need to work through with the dashboard is, what is that balance between the matching criteria, the liability model, and making sure that we don't have too many false negatives, because false negatives mean that, it can potentially damage trust and confidence within the industry and within the product. People will be told that, their pension will be on the dashboard. Imagining going onto a dashboard and thinking, oh yeah, I've got quite a modern pension. And it's coming back and say, well, sorry, Darren Philp hasn't got a pension. Oh, it's Darren Philp. But, so false negatives are bad as well. And I think that, whenever you're in a compulsory environment, questions about liability and accountability and all of that type of stuff come to the fore. And I know the program's still doing its thinking. I know it's still working through some of this stuff, but I think that's going to be one of the key things that is going to be really crucial to the success of the dashboard program. There's other issues such as, how do you sort of project into the future, and how do you develop a common methodology for estimated retirement income and all of that type of stuff. But, that's probably the biggest challenge for me. It's the matching and getting the balance right between the protection and the usefulness of the dashboard in terms of making sure that people see the pensions that they're expecting. So we talked quite a lot about the inputs on the dashboard at the moment, and providers sort of connecting out. And I keep saying dashboard singular, whereas actually I mean dashboards plural, because the government has said, as well as having a public good money and pensions service dashboard, you'll also have commercial or sort of industry-wide dashboards and stuff. And I think, it'll be interesting to see how the regulatory environment around that develops. Yeah, I think that, the real power in pensions dashboards is a link into open pensions and a link into the sort of wider open finance. And we were talking a little while ago about the challenges of communicating and stuff. And, how many people, regularly visit their pension provider's website? If the pension provider has an app, and not many of them do, but if they do, how many people have downloaded the app? How many people go onto the app and check it? Very few. And have we been going about this wrong within the industry over time? Are we trying to get people into a pension space? Whereas actually, shouldn't we be going to where people are already making decisions and getting information and stuff as part of their, managing their daily lives? So I think that, this isn't going to happen instantly, but I think the natural segue from pensions dashboards, plural, into that sort of open pensions and open finance environment could be the real game changer on this. I think it will have to be done softly. I think, it's been very clear that pensions dashboards can't do calculations, and, it's going to be heavily regulated and heavily protected, which is, again, right. Let's go slowly. But also, I think that, that will be the platform to innovate off. And I think, that's where we can really sort of start making a difference in terms of, giving people the information that they want, in the form that they want it, and actually importantly, where they want that information. Yeah, and that information is not necessarily on a pension provider's website.
That's so interesting. Oh, sorry, John.
Go on.
That's actually really exciting, but it just reminds me of a conference and a real in-person conference that I went to about 2 weeks ago in London, and it was a room full of financial advisors, and the speaker was a young entrepreneur that has built a business in marketing, and he's actually, I can't remember his name, which maybe we can find it and add it to the end of this session, but he's the new dragon on Dragon's Den. So it was him who, his name's Stephen, but I can't remember his name. Anyway, that's irrelevant. But so it's picture this, a room full of financial advisors, and they wanted to know, what's the golden ticket to make me successful and engage the client of tomorrow. And basically he said, well, if I wanted financial advice, I'm not going to come to you. I expect you to come to me. And it's exactly what you've just been saying about positioning the dashboard in tomorrow's world rather than, not just today, which is important. It's TikTok and it's Instagram and it's all of those sorts of social media platforms. But what's going to happen tomorrow when everyone's fed up with TikTok? And, it's literally, how are you going to reach those people now and beyond as well? And I think that's interesting.
And I think obviously digital and social and all of that is a really important aspect of this. Yeah. But also I think that some of the mistakes that we've made in pensions in the past is we think pensions are special. Yeah, and we put them sort of on a stool over here and just talk about pensions, and it's not about pensions. Yeah, it's about financial well-being. It's about financial resilience. It's about the whole thing, and you're seeing more and more people, actually not just talk about pensions now. That they will have information about resilience and paying down debt and all of that type of stuff as part of their, if not product offering, then at least in terms of the information and the guidance that they put out there. And that's where open finance and the integration between open finance and the dashboard could really help, because ultimately you're bringing it all together.
Yeah.
I'm an economist by background, for my sins. You've only got so much money to spend over your lifetime. Yeah. Whatever your parents might give you when you're young, what you earn, what you save. Yeah. And really, all you're trying to do is optimize, maximize that income and optimize when you take that income to match your expenditure needs. Yeah. So it's not just about pensions. Yeah. And you've got to sort of view these things in around. And I think we'll start to see that more and more. I think there's obvious challenges around advice, guidance, regulatory perimeters, all of that type of stuff. I think that, there was a big push on robo advice and stuff like that a little while ago. Everyone thought that was going to be a panacea, a big savior. I don't think it's really come through yet. But again, almost saying to people, you've got to go onto this website and engage in this way to be able to get the help and support you need is probably the wrong way to go about it, actually. It's too hard, and actually it's got to be more integrated into what people are doing, day on day. And I firmly believe that, actually. Initiatives like PensionWise and stuff like that are obviously there and they can help, but in a way, the more we have to sort of send people over there to get information, the less likely they are to actually action that and go and get the information. So we need to sort of think outside of the box. We need to think outside of the pensions box and think about how we start sort of joining this stuff up a bit more. And I think we're seeing that a lot more, actually. And I think the pandemic is a good driver of some of this stuff as well. Because, ultimately the whole issues around financial resilience and, the difference between sort of short-term saving, long-term saving, can I afford to save, all of those questions really sort of start coming to the fore. So, there's not many positives from the pandemic in the past 18 months, but, getting people to sort of think and the industry to respond to people's needs, to look at things more holistically from a financial resilience and financial well-being point of view, could be a small sort of silver lining in the cloud of the pandemic.
Certainly, from what you're saying there is echoing. We in one of our previous conversations we spoke to Nicola Morgan from Marks and Spencer's pensions team, and she was saying that they're doing a lot of work with their colleagues around that financial education, financial understanding, and actually linking it all together. And she's saying pretty much what you were saying there about it all being disjointed at the moment. So there's some really good things, but trying to get it all together in the same place, they're having to do that as Marks and Spencer's for their intranet. And one of her hopes was that providers will start to sort of follow that sort of idea to look at how to increase financial resilience of individuals and actually that understanding. So that was quite an interesting point, an interesting parallel there.
And I think that's right. And I think we've got to be careful not to sort of talk in too much generality here, because the employer is obviously a huge pivot, when it comes to pensions and employee benefits and all of that type of stuff. But I don't want to simplify too much, but there's probably two types of employers. There's ones that, really put a lot of stall on and a lot of effort and resource into that sort of wider employee benefits package, of which pensions is a key component alongside other things. And typically, they're not. Then there'll be sort of larger, medium-sized employers again, to generalize, you'll get some smaller ones, but not in the main. And you'll have people like, pensions managers and benefits teams looking at this holistically from an employer perspective. But quite often what I say on this stuff is that then there's a million other employers that have just auto-enrolled people for the first time over the past few years, who basically just see auto-enrollment as another thing that they need to do as a cost of being in business. And I think that's where providers can really, really help and come to the fore, because the employer's not going to do it. Yeah, they might do as they grow, but they can't afford to, especially in the current times. And I think that the more that providers and schemes can start thinking about, okay, it's not just about the pension, and it's things like, as we say, like, couching things in terms of financial well-being, financial resilience. What some of the stuff that we do is we've got a reward scheme, and it's like a perk box type thing. It isn't perk box, but it's like that. And you provide access to those types of benefits, free for the employer, free for the member, and it's a platform on which you can start having a conversation and engaging with people. So you need to look beyond pensions. And just having a conversation about pensions to be able to, actually have the conversation that you want to have.
And going back to your other point about, having to say, currently we're in a position where you have to go over to that site or to that site to look at all these different bits of information. And so we've almost left it as an industry up to each scheme and each provider to do the whole package. So they've not only got to be good at investments, good at administration, good at communications, good at technology, all these things. Whereas actually, we know that there's some really good communicators out there. There's some really, really good communicators, and we don't seem to be as an industry very good at actually taking some advice, across all of those and actually sharing that out and actually having some common approaches. And I guess that's where, statement season or simplified statements kind of comes possibly a bit late to the party, but it is that sort of trying to standardize some things. How do you stand on that sort of standardization perspective versus, everyone doing their own thing?
Yeah, so I'm a big supporter of the simplified benefit statement. I know it's got some critics, and it's not just because my chair, Ruston Smith, was involved in developing the simplified statement. Actually, I just think it was genuinely a good idea. I think it's clear. I think it's engaging. It doesn't mean to say providers can't supplement the information. It's just sort of allowing that sort of comparison. So I think, standardization on stuff like that has got to be good. And, you can then build on top of that propositions that can support some of this stuff. If I was going to be slightly critical of the simplified benefit statement, is that, statements sort of so 1960s, 1970s. So while, it's been a good exercise in sort of really boiling down the information that we need to provide within the current framework, I think, once dashboards are up and running and, the dashboard engine is purring away, then, do we need statements? Are statements sort of outdated? And, arguably over time they will be. But one of the things that, has encouraged me is that the dashboard program are using the simplified statement as a bit of a springboard in terms of some of the information that needs to be presented on the dashboard. So, everything sort of comes around in circles on this stuff, which is quite good. I think, your point before about sort of others and experts on the communication side is really valid. And I think that, more recently, schemes and providers are taking this a lot more seriously. And, you get organisations like the Association of British Insurers putting out good comms guides and stuff like that. And while, you don't necessarily want 100% alignment and 100% standardisation, some standardisation has got to be a good thing. Again, open pensions will help with this as well. because yes, you sort of said some providers have to be good at this and that, and investments, governance, admin, all of this type of stuff. But I think that you see more communication solutions coming off the back of that dashboard. So it won't necessarily just be an aggregator function and just playing back the information that people have. I think the true power of open pensions and pensions dashboards is that ultimately you can, with a degree of standardization, so you can compare apples with apples and all of that type of stuff. But then it will be the communications processes and approaches that come off the back of that are going to be the real changer on this. So yeah, I think statement season's good, and I think the government went for a voluntary, no, not a statement season, a simplified benefit statement was good. I think it's a bit of a shame that more providers didn't pick up and drive this forward, and the government felt it had to legislate. But I think the government is right to legislate on that, and in a way, the providers should be grateful that the government is trying to simplify some of this stuff, because ultimately, we've been calling foul of compliance and complexity for years. So if the government's producing a template and mandating us to use that template, that's got to be quite risk-free for a provider, hasn't it? Just putting that out there. I think I almost made a Freudian slip and said statement season in response to that previous answer. And I think the statement season is more difficult. Yeah, I think as I say, statement season's are old hat. Or statements are old hat. The dashboard is about continual engagement. It's about getting people to engage when they want to engage, and making sure you're facilitating that rather than forcing it down on someone. I know that the pensions minister is very keen on the idea, and some of the reasons for that is he wants to have a national conversation about pensions, and get a bit of a buzz going around pensions, like what happens down under when people talk about their super scheme and all of this type of stuff. And that's great. I think that when you start thinking through the operational implications of the statement season and the volumetrics and what it means for call centres and all of that, I think it gets quite tricky. And I think that, this is a good example, and you can sort of talk about this quite a lot in terms of the stuff that's going on in the policy space at the moment, whereby you've got to be quite clear about what you want to achieve and the behaviour that you want to change and the impact that you want it to have and the benefits of that versus the cost and the disruption. Because one of the things is it's very easy to come up and say, oh yeah, this bit over here is a great idea, we should drive ahead and do that. Yeah, and in isolation, a lot of these things are good ideas. Yeah, as I reserve judgment on the statement season, but a lot of these things are good ideas. But you've got to prioritize on these things. You've got to sort of make sure that the benefits outweigh the costs, because ultimately, where do charges come from? They come from members. We all know that there is pressure to keep charges low, and that's totally right, and that's good. We don't want to go back to the bad old days where people were being charged 1.5% AMC for a pension and all that type of stuff, and that wasn't that long ago. We've come a long way in quite a short space of time there. So, but we just need to remember that ultimately it's the member that's paying for these things. So it's really important that we are getting value. And we're not just sort of delivering value through the scheme, which is obviously absolutely crucial, and is why we have trustees and independent governance committees to ensure that we are delivering that value, but also we're getting value from the interventions as well, and making sure that the interventions work with each other, build on each other, and actually make a difference. And I think that would be my counsel in terms of what's going on at the moment, and it links back to the strategy point that we were talking about right at the start, actually, because on one hand you're sort of strengthening engagement and doing stuff around dashboards and wanting a national conversation and all of that type of stuff, which is great. However, we've got to sort of remember that the underpinnings of all of this stuff are defaults, the power of inertia. The fact that you don't necessarily want people to be engaging all the time on their pensions. Some disengagement is actually good, and that's what the policy of auto enrolment is based on. It means that if you are disengaged, if you don't make a decision, you're saving. So, right engagement at the right time, on the right issues, is what we should be aiming for. And we need to sort of get the balance right between that sort of defaulting and, getting people to take sort of personal control.
Darren, I think that's really, really interesting. And another one of the questions that I wrote down while you were speaking then was, as an industry, do you think that it's suited us to resist technology so far? And with the launch of the dashboard, that actually it's government saying, kind of get with the program, everyone, that this is reality. Yeah. And we are going to mandate this piece of technology, use it as you will, but we hope that it engages and starts people thinking with the education, everything that we've discussed today. But I do feel, and I'd be interested to hear what you think, that there has, it suits us as an industry to have sat back and done the paper statements and, been very manual so far. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, you can argue this one both ways, actually, because, I think if you think about it, there's been lots of consolidation in the provider space, and with more consolidation to come in the scheme space. And, when you're sort of smashing systems together and, running off multiple legacy platforms, investment in new platform technology is incredibly difficult. It's incredibly difficult to get the business case, and actually change has risk. So, it's always going to, there's almost like an inbuilt bias in there in terms of the investment in tech over time. If you couple that with the constant change, that we've seen from regulations, then ultimately we all know that, you have so much resource to improve your proposition, improve your technology, to do what you actually want to do. The more that gets taken up by the stuff that you have to do, because the DWP, the Treasury, the FCA, the regulators says you have to do it, the less you have to be able to sort of really innovate and really sort of look medium term. So I think, we're still, we're still coming out the back end of some of those consolidations, because it takes ages to sort of manage to work out how these things sort of fit together and stuff. But also I think that some of the pace of change has been so great over the past, 10 years or so. It's only 10 years ago since we had auto enrollment, we had freedom and choice. There's been all sorts of stuff that has required sort of some quite big systems changes and quite big sort of IT interventions and stuff that ultimately that we can't underestimate how much work there is at the provider level, just keeping compliant and just doing what you're told to do. So I think, as I say, you can argue it sort of both ways, and you can always, it's always easier to put off that big capital spend decision to the next year or whatever, and you could argue that the industry has been a bit short-sighted on that. But then you can also create some arguments as to, given what's going on and given everything that's changed and all of that type of stuff, that they might not be excuses, but there are reasons that sort of almost pull the other way. And if you think about it, no CEO ever gets praised for doing a platform swap smoothly. Especially the advisor trades are sort of littered with this platform transition going wrong, that platform transition going wrong, and all of that type of stuff. So it's a big project. It's a big project that you really have to commit to. And it's really difficult to do that when you're in an environment that isn't static for 2 minutes, So, I won't blame the providers totally, but I can certainly see where you're coming from in terms of, that lack of investment. Although I think that's changing. I do think that's changing, but it will take time, dashboard will be a driver of this. I think, over time, we're very institutional when it comes to pensions. We're very workplace, oriented. I think, and that's good. But ultimately, DC pensions, it's an individual product. We've talked about engagement. We've talked about people looking at their DC pension within the round and all of that type of stuff. And I think there's going to be a lot more sort of individual personalization and a lot more individual control over this over time. I can see, doing a bit of crystal ball gazing, that, people, at the moment can't choose their auto enrolment scheme. It's the employer that chooses it. I can see in 10 years' time, moving to more of an Australian model that, if someone wants to choose their pension scheme, they can, and they can divert their employer contribution over to this scheme here rather than the default employer contribution. And it'll just be like a bank account, and it'll just be like running a normal payroll. I think we're a little away from that yet. But
it was in the mentioned in one of the recent consultation documents as well, which I raised my eyebrows. I was like, okay, this is interesting. And as a personal saver, I would not choose to be with the provider I currently am with. I'm not saying who that is, but I wouldn't choose to be with them.
I'm sure I could Google it and find it out.
You probably can. But the service and the range of what I want to do is not there. The app is not great. The quality of comms isn't great. The quality of investments and the timing, I want a bit more from mine. But equally, for someone that doesn't want that, it might be ideal. Someone that just wants to leave it and let it stew, exactly, might be absolutely spot on.
Exactly, and as I say, I don't think this will change instantly, but I can see as if the dashboard does move the dial in terms of engagement, and there's an if there, it will certainly do something. But and I think that consumers are very good at demanding what they want and voting with their feet, and I think increasingly they will, especially in the digital world. We're a little bit
picked up on the dashboard side is that is a real risk, I think, for providers if they do a bad job. People will vote with their feet. It might be awkward, but if they get hacked off with something, they'll move to another provider.
I think that's right, and I think it will get to the point whereby individuals will start saying, well, if I can't go to that employer, that I can't use that provider over there because I lose my employer auto enrolment contribution. What? That doesn't make sense. Exactly. So I think over time there might be more demand for that, and we seem to be following a bit of an Australian path in some of this stuff. And it's what they do in Australia. And I think, again, you can argue there's pros and cons to it. Of course there are. But if one of the big issues is, keeping people connected with their pensions, if one of the big issues is ownership, then having more of a hybrid model where you've got strong defaults right the way through the system. But if you are an engaged individual and you do want to choose your own scheme or your own provider, then why shouldn't the system be able to do that? That's sort of consumer choice. That's a market potentially working. Yeah. So we might have to do this again in 10 years or so and see whether that crystal ball prediction is right, or whether the crystal ball was a bit cloudy today.
It's interesting because I've been obviously Bravura is an Australian company, and I've been doing some work over the last few months with some of our Australian colleagues, and it is really interesting to sort of to compare and contrast. And in some ways, the UK is sort of further ahead in that sort of transparency and cost place. But then from a choice perspective, the Australian are much further forward. And it's really interesting to compare and contrast those. So it'll be interesting over the next 10 years for us actually to have a look and see, if we come up somewhere in the middle for both of them. I don't know.
Yeah, and I think it's always interesting to look at DC around the world. Yeah, and we're having a debate in Australia about how do we get people to annuitize, and is it right that people can just cash out? And I think the Australian politicians and the Australian industry was looking at the UK thinking they might have this right, and then we rip that up and go to the Australian model. It's just like but I think as DC starts maturing. Yeah, and DC is more mature in Australia, I would argue, in some respects, especially in terms of fund balances and size and the consolidation that's happened and all of that type of stuff. I think there's great learnings from across the world on some of this stuff, and there's no right answer. Yeah, and ultimately, some of it you just learn through your mistakes, and there's some elements of policy that work and some interventions that work and work effectively. There's some that don't work and they won't work and they can cause more harm than good. And I think the sensible place to end up is that sort of test and learn. It's that, okay, we'll try something, if it works, great, we'll build on it. If it doesn't work, then we're not frightened of thinking, okay, we need to try something else. But sort of almost, again, going back to where we started the conversation, that's got to be in line with, what outcomes are we actually trying to achieve? Because, you need alignment on those outcomes and that sort of broad strategy to be able to assess whether interventions are going to be effective or not.
That's massive. Now, before I ask our final question, there's one thing that I have written down. I don't know if there's anything, Emma, you wanted to pick up on, but I will ask mine first. And we spoke a little bit about, well, quite a lot really, about making changes and then there being consequences. So obviously, freedom and choice came in a few years back, and that was sort of a bit of an earthquake through the industry and generally, and there's been a whole heap of consequences from that. How do you see that has really affected the sort of individual saver? The sort of perhaps less sophisticated saver.
So I think the freedom and choice reforms really did polarize some people. Or to polarize the debate. And I think people, think that the system before freedom and choice worked, and was effective, and it wasn't, and it didn't. So, annuities, while having lots of, positive traits, didn't really affect the way that people wanted to live their lives and take their money, because it was a forced buy, a forced purchase. I personally think that market got a bit lazy in terms of pricing and all of that type of stuff. And we know that annuities are a very complex product, and, were people always getting the right product? There were cases of annuity mis-selling and all of that type of stuff. But I think there was a real sort of confidence issue in annuities, and the system wasn't fit for purpose. So I think it was a brave move to rip it up overnight, but it was probably a necessary move. And I think, at the whole and at the time, I supported the reforms. And I still do. I think they're the right thing to do. Like anything, and if you think about the timing of when this reform was announced and then implemented, there were certain political and electoral cycle sort of considerations behind it. And it meant that the implementation of the reforms was rushed, and horribly rushed. And I think that's my one criticism, that there was a hiatus there in terms of, okay, we're removing the shackles of having to buy an annuity, but there was no time for proper rules, proper regulations, proper safeguards to come out and to bed in. There was not enough time for sort of product development and solution development to support people. And when I was at my previous place, People's Pension, we did some research alongside State Street Global Advisors. We did a series called New Choices, Big Decisions, which basically charted people through their experiences when it came to sort of dealing with freedom and choice. And the questions or the insights, and I won't go into a lot of detail, but people using words like minefield, it's an absolute maze. It's so complicated. There was so much sort of, decision making blight and all of that type of stuff, or planning blight, because, people were just sort of, faced with loads of options. They had that freedom, they had that choice, but they did not know how to exercise it. I think that, over time, the market has started to respond and regulation has started to respond. And I think you've got different parts of the market as well. So, if you've got an advisor, you can get some pretty good and sophisticated drawdown products that are out there. And, in the auto enrollment case, then, a lot of pot sizes are still quite small for people who are retiring. So quite often the game is about cashing out. And just sort of doing that in the most sort of tax efficient way. I think that, the introduction of investment pathways, is quite an interesting development from an FCA perspective, because ultimately what you're trying to do there is to get people focused on the outcome that they want, i.e., are they going to take cash in the next 5 years? Are they going to do this? Are they going to do that? Without having to worry too much about the underlying investment or the underlying product that sits beneath that. And in a way, that should be a bit of a mantra. And it goes back to the not quite fuel analogy, but we were talking about earlier. But it goes back to that point where you need to know the destination. You want people to think about the trade-offs, about whether they want money now or money in the future, or whether they want flexible income or guaranteed income. That's the conversations we should be having. People, we shouldn't be having conversations with people about, and you can achieve that by investing in this whizzy fund that does all this over here. And that's what Investment Pathways does. I think the governance and the structure of master trusts will allow sort of more sophisticated out-retirement solutions to develop over time, but that will develop commensurate with demand.
Yeah.
I think that again, it'll become more incumbent on providers to be able to provide those strong guided journeys to help people understand and act off the back of trade-offs. So I think it was a good thing. Like the old system needed blowing up and starting again. It really did. I think that the concern was that it was rushed. And I think we're still reeling from the consequences of that. But blimey, what a platform to innovate off the back of.
Yes.
Yes, it's difficult. It's not always easy, but I think that again, thinking about dashboard, thinking about pot consolidation, thinking about how this stuff fits in with people's wider finances. Rather than just having to sort of blindly buy an annuity, you can actually create a blended type solution that can really meet people's needs. And I think, tech and innovation and all of that type of stuff will help, drive some of that. We're not there yet, some of us, and, we've got products on the market that do some of this and all of that type of stuff, but it's still early days. But I really think that you'll see some innovation in this space over the next 5 years. I certainly hope so anyway.
Yeah, I can completely agree on that. Thank you. Thanks for that, Darren. Emma, anything you wanted to?
And not particularly, but I would like to ask Darren the final question.
Absolutely.
If that's okay. I've been asking these questions to all of our interviewees over this series. And it is, if you were the pensions minister, let's put it like that. If you were the pensions minister and you had your magic wand and you could only change one thing in UK pensions today, what would that one thing be?
Really difficult question, and you actually gave me forewarning as well. But then the more you think about it, the more it's difficult to choose one thing. But I think there's a theme when it comes to pensions, and we've already mentioned this pensions commission and all of that type of stuff. And there is sometimes this school of thought that says we need to take the politics out of pensions. If we take the politics out of pensions, everything will be all right. Wrong. Yeah. Pensions is highly political. It's about tax rates. It's about benefit structures. It's about compelling employers to make contributions. It's about regulation and all of that type of stuff. You cannot take the politics out of pensions. Yeah, you really can't. However, you do need a long-term stable framework for improving the industry, for trying things out, for developing policies, and importantly evaluating. I think there's and people often talk about we need to sort of have a permanent pensions commission, and again that sort of doesn't really do it for me, because a commission is there to sort of address a certain challenge, and to come up with solutions. But I think a framework for pensions, against which we can hold politicians to account. Yeah. So you've got the vision, you've got the narrative, and then there's trade-offs, and there's always trade-offs. Yeah. Like, there's a big trade-off the other day, like, do you continue with the triple lock or not for this year? There's trade-offs there. You can argue it both ways. You can argue it from a fiscal point of view. You can argue it from a fairness point of view. You can argue it from a sort of an adequacy and retirement point of view. There's not necessarily a right answer. Yeah. But I think, to help join some of this stuff up, Yeah, and to sort of at least get ministers and politicians and regulators to be clear about the trade-offs that they are making and the impact on the end system, yeah, would be my sort of key ask, and that would be my magic wand, because I think ultimately that would develop a better policy framework. And it doesn't mean to say you're restricting ministers on what they can do. You can't do that, yeah. And it's for ministers to take decisions and stuff, but just to sort of almost sort of have a bit more openness and transparency around, okay, yeah, we know this isn't good over here, but the reason we're doing this is over here, so you can then assess it within a framework. And I'm going to put a shameful plug in now. I hope you don't mind, but I'm a governor and a trustee of the Pensions Policy Institute. So it's a charity that sort of does pensions research and pensions analysis. And one of the projects that they've got on at the moment is to look at developing that pensions framework. So again, it doesn't quite go as far as what I've just sort of said or I've mentioned, but there's an obvious gap in the market, and I think by having that framework, it encourages a bit more long-term thinking, and I think that's what we need.
Yeah, that's spot on. I think that sort of really links into everything from the education piece to the technology piece, the comms, and having a long-term framework, I think gives everybody something to shoot towards.
I think that's right.
So thank you very much, Darren. Thank you for your time today. Thank you for your input and insight. I think it's been really interesting, especially from my perspective. I always enjoy these conversations because it makes me think more about an industry that I spent too many years in, arguably, and fascinating. So thank you very, very much.
And thank you very much for inviting me on. It's been great to chat.
Wonderful.
Thank you, Darren. Thanks.
Thank you.